I had been stationed at the camp for 2 years now, away from the family that I hadn't seen for the past 4 months. Not seeing my family for so long had started taking a toll on me. My wife had also started mentioning my prolonged absence and how she and the kids were missing me. So I decided to take the 4th of July weekend off and finally visited my family after so long. It was a happy experience overall. Everyone was so happy at finally getting together that I wished the day would never end. But I didn't know how long the day was actually going to be for me. So much so that I would soon start wishing that this curse hadn't even started in the first place. After a long day of stuffing down hot dogs and hamburgers and playing around with my kids, I received a text from my brother, Gary. That came as a bit of a surprise to me as we hadn't talked to each other in so long. My brother Gary was 10 years younger than me, and as a late child, he was spoiled rotten by my parents. Ever since his childhood, he had always gotten away with whatever he wanted, and even my parents always urged me to take care of him as he was my baby brother. That had made him very headstrong and irresponsible, and the one thing he was very known for was excessive partying and lavish spending. I was used to getting his texts and calls at ungodly hours, and then picking him up from a sidewalk or a parking lot after one party or the other. But all of that had stopped when I got stationed away from home. He had stopped texting when he realized I wasn't available at his beck and call anymore. So I was understandably very upset with him knowing that I had come back for the weekend to be with family, as I hadn't told him about me coming back. He sent me a text detailing an address and told me to bring his truck and text him back when I got close to the place. The address seemed to be a motel in a small town that was a bit of a drive from my place. I half wanted to ignore the text, but Gary is very known for heavy drinking, and I didn't want him to make a scene and mess this up for me on my 4th with the family. So I decided to be the bigger man once again. I took his truck and set off for the location that he texted me. It was a few hours long drive. I must have texted him 4 or 5 times as I reached closer to the location, but I never got any response. Even my calls went unanswered. I pulled up to the address he sent me. It looked as if the motel was abandoned with no cars in the parking lot. As I got out and looked around, no one seemed to be in sight. It appeared as if not only the motel, but the whole town might be abandoned. But even when I couldn't see anyone around, I could feel the pinpricks of someone staring at me. It was all getting really creepy, and I started to get very bad vibes about this whole entire town. It was getting very late in the evening already, and soon it would get dark. My sixth sense had started giving me warnings. But putting up a brave front as my curious nature won out rather than my self-preservation, I went ahead and started looking around. As I surveyed the area, I realized some signs of recent life, like open drinks, half-eaten food, switched-on lights in the surrounding buildings, and other knickknacks that spelled out that someone had left these things in a hurry. To me, this all spoke of the presence of some criminals around the area who had hid themselves because they didn't want to be seen. That made me worry about my brother's safety, considering this was the address he sent me about his whereabouts. So I hurried to check around in the surrounding buildings and see if I could find something. While I was checking the buildings, the night had already fallen. I could see the moon rising in the sky as I was coming out of a coffee shop. That's when I started hearing howls and groans coming from all over. It seemed as if everyone in the vicinity was going through something at the same time, and that something seemed a bit painful. Being able to hear all these sounds but being unable to see what exactly was going on was making me very uncomfortable. I ran back inside the coffee shop and locked the door behind me, shutting off all the lights in the shop. I peeked my head out of the window curtain to see what all the commotion was about, and what I saw was surreal as well as terrifying. A mixture of humans as well as what appeared to be wolves, werewolves my mind supplied, were walking out of the buildings and trees. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had only heard about these creatures in mythical or fantasy stories and movies, and now I was seeing them walking around in front of my eyes. Maybe there's a fancy dress thing going on here, I reasoned with myself, but even when I was saying that, I knew I was wrong. Their howls towards the moon said so. The reality was that I was trapped in a town full of werewolves. All of them kept running around and roaring towards the moon. Watching the spectacle was quite unsettling. I had to think of a way to get out of here, and I had to think it fast. After a little bit, they appeared to be calming down. The worst of it might have been over, I thought, but I couldn't even finish my thought before something even worse started to conspire. They started bringing out humans, captive humans with their hands and mouths tied, about half a dozen of them. I could feel my throat drying even further, wondering what was about to happen to those poor souls. Even when panicking, I realized my brother was not among them. I didn't know whether to be thankful or more worried about it, considering what it might entail for his safety. The werewolves threw them on the pavement right in front of the cafe building I was hiding behind. It was terrifying to be this close to them, separated by just a wall between us. I didn't even realize for how long I had been holding my breath. The instincts that had wanted me to run quietly from there were now urging me to save these helpless people instead of leaving them to their fate. The werewolves had started dancing around, mumbling gibberish and bowing. I concluded that they must have been worshipping the moon. As I was looking around, thinking of a way to get out of there, I realized that they had switched off all the lights, and the only light was now coming from the moon, full in all its glory. The area we were now in was relatively darker, shaded by the trees. I could take advantage of the dark and get the captives and maybe try running, I reasoned with myself. I unlocked the door and stealthily tried to get outside. The door creaked a bit, but all the racket the werewolves were making masked the sound of the door. I crept up towards the captives. They startled a bit, noticing me, but I signaled them to keep quiet. The first one I reached seemed to be a teenage girl. I could see the desperation and fear in her eyes. I hurriedly untied her hands and motioned her to help the others. She scrambled on her feet, and we hurriedly made to untie all of them. Instead of running away immediately and drawing their attention towards us, I told them to get inside the cafe for the time being. We entered the cafe and locked the door behind us. As we were hiding in the dark, holding our breath, one of the prisoners told me how they had all come to a party in this town through a mysterious invitation. When they came to the party, the place seemed like a regular town. The party was going on in full swing in the town hall. A lot of people were there, drinking, smoking, having fun, unaware of what was to befall them. But just as nightfall approached, some people started acting weird, howling and ripping their clothes off. They also appeared to be in pain, and then all of a sudden there were wolves standing upright in place of the humans. The wolves attacked the nearest person they could reach all of a sudden, and then there were just screams and howls and blood. Some of them were saved from the slaughter for the night of the full moon, and they were going to be devoured under the moon. I also asked them about my brother, but no one could tell me about him. While we were busy catching up, the earlier commotion seemed to be dying down. But just then, another hell broke loose. The wolves had noticed our absence. They rushed around shouting and screaming. Soon they rushed towards the cafe as if they could smell us inside, banging and bumping against the door. The door was quite strong, so it held them off, but we had to think of something before it gave out under their pressure. I instructed everyone to look around the whole cafe and see if we could find anything helpful. We found a back door in the kitchen and decided to get out of there By the time we were all through the door, the front door had started to give out. We started running with all our might. There were trees behind the cafe, and as we kept running, the trees kept getting denser. It also got more difficult to see in the dark as the trees prevented the moonlight. Soon we could hear the roars coming from behind us. The wolves had given chase. I kept running and running. At that moment, I couldn't think of anything other than getting out of there alive. I stumbled on the fallen branches and the tree roots, but I kept running. I could also hear others coming behind me, running, falling, running again. The wolves soon started catching up to us. I looked behind just in time to see the first werewolf breaking through the trees, and right in front of my eyes, it growled, and in the next moment, it had taken a man in its mouth. The growls and screams were all I could hear now. I could hear other people screaming behind me, succumbing to a similar fate. I sped up again with a new fervor. Desperation to stay alive made me run as I had never run before in my life. Just as I thought the end was near, and I had sent a silent love you to my family, a ray of light started shining again in the form of a light coming a little far ahead. It looked like a light coming from a hut ahead. I asked everyone to rush towards the hut. As we neared the hut, the wolves did too. The noose was getting tighter and tighter. I started shouting for help, so if anyone was inside the hut, they might hear us. A tall, thin, gray-bearded man opened the door of the hut. He appeared weary with a shotgun poised in front of him. He soon got the hang of the situation and fired gunshots over our head at the werewolves. He moved aside and let us all inside his cabin. Only 3 of us were left by this time. He slammed the door behind us and aimed his rifle at us, yelling, asking if we had been scratched or bitten by the werewolves. We looked around, making sure none of us were. We explained to him how we came to be in the town and how we were captured and escaped and eventually chased all around the town by the werewolves. As our story progressed, he began to show a mysterious smirk on his face. He placed the shotgun next to his chair and listened to us. As my companions were explaining to him the further details, I decided to call the police. Even if they might not believe me initially, I knew I had to do something about it, and this was the least I could do in the moment. This might also prove to be our rescue, as I had no idea where I was. I pulled out my cell phone, but decided to call my brother first before calling the police. I could hear the phone ringing on the other line, but what caught me off guard was that I could also hear my brother's cell phone chirping just behind the kitchen counter of the hut. I looked up at the man sitting in front of me, about to ask him if he knew anything about my brother, but I didn't have to ask him the question. The answer was already written on his face, in his cruelly amused eyes and his rapidly increasing, meaningful smirk. Yeah, he knew about my brother, but not in the way I wanted him to know. We were chased by one trouble to another, one that might be even bigger than the previous. I stayed rooted at my place as we watched the old man jump from his chair, making it go reeling backwards and ripping off his shirt right in front of our eyes. He began to change into a werewolf. Oh boy. Wasn't that the classic case of out of the frying pan into the fire?